Let's bring in Grégoire Roos, who's Director of Europe, Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Grégoire, thanks for being with us. We've got a lot to cover, so I'll keep my questions short. Starting with the Greenland situation. Can Europe now afford to sort of breathe a sigh of relief, or should, as Emmanuel Macron says, Europe remain vigilant?
Well, obviously both. I think we have seen quite of an intense week. And interestingly enough, although it's true in your reportage a few moments ago, you stressed that there was no real alignment or consensus between the 27 heads of state and government. We've seen a kind of convergence in terms of messaging to Donald Trump, that Europe is really willing to take its destiny in its own hands and pay the price for it. And we even got to hear the president of the European Commission call of independence, which is something you would never have imagined, certainly not from a German national. So things are changing. Of course, they're changeable by European standard, very slow, but they are changing. And secondly, to answer your question more properly, they have bought time. And I think they have bought time in a rather smart fashion. So without real fuss, but by at last taking the full measure of the power on which they have been sitting for so long, their single market, and the dependencies that many around the world entertain vis-à-vis the single market. Actually, China and the US are dependent on the single market for different reasons. And if you read the National Security Strategy released last December, it clearly states that the transatlantic bond in terms of trade is the backbone of the not just the US economy, but future US economic prosperity. So Europe can too weaponize such a thing as the economy and actually as their single market. So in this regard, I would say it's a success. Of course, they need to remain vigilant, because with Donald Trump, what we have, I think, got to measure by now is that there's a lot of volatility, versatility, and therefore what is off the table today can be back on the table tomorrow. And the best way of keeping deterrence as high as possible is to also show that Europe is prepared for any kind of scenario.
So the kind of military exercises that we're set to see in Greenland, is that going to exacerbate the situation?
I'm not so sure. I mean, you might have read that although this is not really a formal meeting of the European Council, the European heads of state and government have decided to proceed with the negotiations and with the US, the transatlantic US-EU trade deal. I think that shows one thing, that the EU really wants to remain a reliable partner and want to abide by its commitments. That's the first thing. The second, that the EU is not really willing to, I'd say, fuel more market instability. It's certainly not what the EU needs at the moment. And third, that it wants to avoid giving Donald Trump some arguments to, pretentiously show that Europe is not a reliable partner and deserves to be somehow punished and cannot be trusted. So I think it's rather smart. But as you've just said in a moment ago, it will be crucial now to move quickly to make sure that the first pillars of strategic autonomy are really being built as fast as possible. Time is one thing. I think this is checked, and successfully so. Political and policy delivery is another thing. And this is where political leadership, and to go back to the speech of President Zelenskyy, determination and resolve will matter.
Indeed. Zelenskyy, of course, was very critical of Europe in his speech. Not at all of Donald Trump, it seemed. But he didn't pull his punches, did he, in his criticism of Europe and the way it's behaved over the past year?
I found it a fascinating speech. Actually, I had to watch it because I was on your TV channel at the same time. So actually, I had to watch it live. I must say it was fascinating. First of all, I must say I've never seen President Zelenskyy so jovial, so cheerful than he was this afternoon. So I cannot imagine that the meeting with Donald Trump didn't go well. I guess he heard things that he might not have hoped to hear. So, in this regard, we should be happy for him and therefore for Ukraine and for European security. The second is that what we, of course, refrain from doing in the think tank community is to working with our emotions. if I were working with my emotions, I would tell you that this was an incredible speech that was a bit harsh on Europe, to be honest. But this is something we should really avoid in geopolitical analysis. So what he said was spot on. And if I had, closing my eyes, wondering who was speaking or just reading the speech, I could have thought that this was a freshly elected head of state or government of one of the 27 member states of the European Union. He is not. He's an inspiring head of government, head of state of a potentially future member state of the European Union. The real question for me is really, you can say everything. I'm not sure you can say everything anywhere. And the audience matters. European leaders, Bart de Wever spoke on a panel, Chancellor Merz spoke later this afternoon, President Macron yesterday, President von der Leyen 2 days ago. They really tried in very different ways to convey the same message of resolution, determination to act, and that, Europe wouldn't be bullied. What we heard from the Ukrainian president was a bit different, was a bit harsh on Europe. Let's not forget that Europe gave more money than the US, covering both military and financial support. It's quite significant in spite of some division amongst 27 member states. But what will be extremely interesting to monitor in the next few weeks is how his speech will play off and what kind of impact it will have on the electorate, especially the electorate of far-right parties in the big countries in Europe, not just the EU, Europe, so the UK, France and Germany. It might be that this kind of tone somehow gives some arguments to the leaders of the far-right parties in the three countries. I'm not saying it will, I'm saying it might. And it will be interesting. But saying that Europe is slow is true. Saying that Europe has done nothing is simply not true. The coalition of the willing under the leadership of Sir Keir Starmer and President Macron did deliver a few things, and first among which aligning US and EU sanctions. And we will get to see in the upcoming months the full extent of the economic impact of those sanctions. You might have heard that the French have seized a tanker off the coast of France. This comes a few weeks after the British and the Americans seized another tanker off the coast of Iceland. So we will see the kind of recomposing and resolution spirit of the Europeans in the next few weeks. But some nuance sometimes would help. But again, I think there has been so much tremendous pressure on the shoulders of the president of Ukraine that today for him seems to have been a rather good day. Also, I assume.
Indeed. Well, let's hope that is the case. Grégoire, the words of Zelenskyy regarding Europe's defence are basically saying Europe needs to wake up to the threat on its doorstep, pointing the finger at Vladimir Putin and Russia. He went on to talk about the fact, in his eyes, that Ukraine could be very much key to any kind of pan-European defence force should that ever come to pass. Is that the case? Is Europe really at a point now where it really needs to wake up and really consider its collective defence in the way that Zelenskyy is saying?
And I might sound like the Brussels advocate, and I'm happy to play that card tonight, but there is such a small force. After the developments in the Sahel with the French army fighting on its own for almost a decade, the European Union created a kind of contingent of up to 5,000 troops to be able to be deployed anywhere where the vital and strategic interests of the European Union are threatened. So de facto, it does exist, but of course it's not a European army. I will be honest, I don't see that happening anytime soon for now. What really happens is the ability of rebuilding stockpiles, of muscling up civilian preparedness, and I think in this regard there's a lot that has to be done across the bloc. What we've got to see in Finland or Poland is absolutely not what we've got to see in France or Germany when we're speaking of a kind of non-compulsory, voluntary sort of military service. What President Macron, with all his spirit of imagination, has come up with is a 6-month non-compulsory military service. I'm not so sure that this will really muscle up the European deterrence. And so there's a kind of a real gap between reaching the level of the European army and getting sense that European peoples are coming to terms with the harsh reality that that war is back. That war is back indeed. And in this regard, it's something that's been much commented on in France when the chief of staff said that France should be ready to send our children to die. Of course, he didn't say, whether it was a kind of metaphor for the soldiers, but some could argue that it's not a metaphor for soldiers, it's the population. And when war is on your doorstep, you need to be able to prepare to fight, to defend yourself. And this has created a real uproar in France. And most probably that would have created the same in many European countries. We're very far from a European army, because even if you have a European army, whom will you send? You need to be ready to fight. And I'm not sure that we are psychologically ready. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I guess that what would be interesting to see, and that would be a first step towards the European army, is rather than having sort of a fragmented market, if you will, of small, very costly for that matter, military services, is something rooted in, of course, national identities and threat perceptions, but with a strong European dimension. You could have such a thing as a coalition of the willing member states who would say, let's put resources together and we'll have something of the length, serious enough as what you have in Israel, up to 2 years, seriously at the level of the threat, and you would have up to 6 months to a year in everyone's home country, and then you'll spend 1 more year in another European country, and you'll get to understand, what kind of threats does the country feel, depending on the geography and on a whole lot of different criteria. And we're not there yet. So we really need more, I think, leadership in this regard to understand that the answers won't stay at national level.
Grégoire Roos, thank you very much indeed for that very thorough examination of the issues facing the EU summit. Greenland, Ukraine, and of course, and beyond. Pleasure to have you on board once again. Grégoire Roos, Director of Europe, Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Thank you, sir, very much indeed.